Okay, it looks like everyone is in from the waiting room. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. I know it's a busy time of year for everyone. For folks that don't know, my name is Nicole Trevina Flores. I'm the Global Ed Coordinator for SCC, and we will continue featuring these Lunch and Learns the second Friday of every month at noon. So I hope that you will join us. That calendar invite should be out there. So just come back to that same invite each time. I really want to thank you for dedicating your time. We just are also limited, and having time to put toward these incredibly beneficial events is so special. I did also want to put a plug. We have a fundraising event coming up here on October 6th. So that all the proceeds of that go to our travel scholarship for our students. So please, if you can, I just put the invite there, and hopefully you can join us. But we will continue with our Lunch and Learns and our book club each month. And then we'll also have International Ed Week. So save the week of November 14th to the 17th as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Courtney Bruntz, and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Today, we are featuring the Harvest Moon Festival, which tonight you'll be able to see this very big moon outside your window. So I encourage you to look at it. And tomorrow at Antelope Park at 4 p.m., there's the Harvest Moon Festival put on by the Asian Cultural Center. I'm joined today by a friend of mine, Jewel Jun, and Jessie Jiang, who I met in 2007, a long time ago. I can't believe it's been that long.
Right.
Jessie and I met in Wuhan in 2007 when my husband and I were teaching English at Huazhong Shifan Dashui, Huazhong Normal University. So Jessie, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Jessie, can we start off a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your academic background, what you studied in college, and what brought you to the US?
Sure. So I studied Chinese linguistics and literature for my undergraduate degree at Huazhong Normal University, where Courtney and her husband worked before. And then when I was a first year graduate student, I was selected by the Kansas State Department of Education to be a visiting scholar to teach Mandarin for several K-12 Kansas schools. And then a year later, I decided I would like to apply for a PhD program in America. So eventually I got my PhD in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in foreign language education from the University of Kansas.
Great, thank you. Are you still teaching Chinese?
That's my main interest, but I'm not teaching right now, thanks to COVID. But it will change.
Well, probably your Jenna, your four and a half year old.
Yes, she's learning both at home and at school.
Great, that's great. So not only is Jessie going to talk to us about the Harvest Moon Festival, but also about Wuhan. And many people hadn't ever heard about Wuhan until coronavirus. And my husband and I, Michael, benefited to buy masks early because of Jessie and her family. They let us know. They sent us texts letting us know to get masks really early. Wuhan is positioned along the Yangtze River. It's one of the two big rivers in China. It's the capital of Hubei province. It's this major industrial and commercial city, has over 11 million people, known for really spicy food. The wuchang yi, which is a spicy long fish, and it's breakfast food. So, and if you haven't heard of Wuhan, do a quick Google search to map it out. Jessie, tell us about Wuhan. What distinguishes it from other Chinese cities? What it was famous for? What it was like to grow up there?
It's so funny because before people ask me where you're from, I would say I'm from Wuhan, but I have to explain it like this. But now I don't have to. Everyone knows. But still, I feel they don't really get the big picture about the city. There are a lot of misunderstanding, bias about it. So it's really a great opportunity to share my personal experience because I was born and grew up in Wuhan. But honestly, I really disliked Wuhan, this city, until I came to America when I was 24. It's so interesting because the reason I dislike it is because the summer in Wuhan is so long and it's very hot and very humid. Basically, I would say it's like weather in Houston, summer in Houston. And the city is so big that also it was divided by Yangtze River and the Han River. So it's spread into 3 major districts. And it's so big that actually I barely visited the other 2 parts of the town. And also sometimes it's very common. I got stuck in a traffic jam and it could last for hours. At one time I got stuck in a traffic jam, it's in a bus and we got stuck there for 3 hours. So it's always very crowded and very loud. So that's the reason I really disliked it. But after I came to Kansas, I just realized what I missed and liked about this city the most is the very hustle and bustle life in Wuhan. So I would like to share some pictures I found. I had a lot of old pictures, but I couldn't find it. So I found a blog based in Wuhan that they have a lot of great local pictures. And let's see, here we go. So when I show you the pictures, see. When I show you the pictures, I would like to talk about this city, why I like it so much now. So when I visited my family in Wuhan after a year living in Kansas, so the first year I was in Kansas, I tried various kinds of, let's see, show this one. So I tried various kinds of breakfast. And usually in the morning with a plastic stool sitting on the sidewalk. And 2 hours later, I had to stuff myself again at a hot pot restaurant, where I would go to a Sichuan restaurant. So it's all spicy. And then after dinner, I would walk around a nearby night market. So from the first picture on the left, you can see that's the first bridge they built in 1950s across the Yangtze River. And the end of that bridge is the Yellow Crane Tower. And actually they rebuilt it in 1983. And the main architect was one of my uncles. So this city really has some special connection with my family. And then the middle part will show you they start to build more and more bridges across the Yangtze River. So make the travel within the city much easier. And then the right side, it's a very modern city. And then this is the area that I grew up. It's called Hankou. If you look at an old map, you can still see that they don't mark Wuhan if it's a very old map. They would say Hankou. And then old and new. So we still have the old part, which is really interesting because the old part, they kept the architecture and the buildings from the concession time. So there are a lot of different foreign countries built there, offices, banks, and residential buildings during that time. And then also there are some pictures here, shows day and night. So Yangtze River, big rivers. So people like to do swimming, and at nighttime during night market. And I think 2 things distinguish Wuhan from other Chinese cities. One is its location. So all the train routes come through Wuhan, and that means you can hop onto a fast train in the morning, and usually within a half day, you can arrive in most cities in China. So that's very incredible. And the other thing I think it's remarkable history. Most people don't mention about that. They talk about Beijing with long history of the Forbidden City, Shanghai, that's a very international city. But for Wuhan, the remarkable history was that the beginning of the 1911 revolution, which is the revolution that ended China's last imperial dynasty, started in Wuhan on October 10th, 1911. October 10th, 1911 is also the date that people celebrate in Taiwan. The founder, the father of Taiwan, Sun Yat-sen, he started this revolution, and it happened in Wuhan. So I think that's very remarkable. And as I said, I think Wuhan is famous for its love for breakfast. And I always call it the capital of Chinese breakfast. You can order different things for breakfast and not to have the same dish for a month. So we have different things for a month. And if a local like Wuhan doesn't have breakfast for some reason, then the whole day is ruined. So I first thought it's my problem. And I talk to other friends and I say, yes, it is. How can you not have a good breakfast? And the most Wuhan style of having breakfast, so I'll show you some of that. It's either you sit on a plastic stool on a sidewalk, or you walk or ride a bike with your breakfast in your hands. So we all have that crazy skills. And that's some very typical Wuhan breakfast we have. It's 热干面, dry noodles, and different things, but mainly carbs. And then the right picture, this person holding a bowl and walking, that's very common in Wuhan. So that's my impression about my hometown. It changed.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Do you still cook roganmian at home, or?
I do. And the most interesting, I found the noodles that is the closest to the noodles of 热干面 is actually spaghetti, because it doesn't get so like sticky to each other.
That's great. So if you're just joining us, we are welcoming Jessie Jiang, who currently lives in Chicago, but did her PhD program in Kansas and is a Wuhan-ren, so a person of Wuhan. So it's a great opportunity to learn more about Wuhan, which has made the news over the past few years because of coronavirus, but also to talk about the Harvest Moon Festival. So for those who haven't experienced the Harvest Moon Festival before, it's, in Chinese culture, festivals are really important and they're times to get together. And so, and tonight and tomorrow is the celebration of the Harvest Moon. So Jessie, can you tell us about that festival, what stories it celebrates, any history that you can tell us about the Harvest Moon?
Sure. So the Harvest Moon Festival, we call it 中秋节 in Chinese. If you do the word for word translation, it would be Mid-Autumn Festival. So it's on the evening of the 15th day of the 8th month on lunar calendar. It's not the calendar we use right now. It's on lunar calendar. The moon appears at its brightest, and for one night only, it's said to be perfectly round. So that's usually happen in September since it's on lunar calendar. And we also usually say like the roundest and brightest day usually on that night, and sometimes the next day too. So if you miss one on tonight, try the next day. And the history of this holiday, I have to say, it dates back about over 3,000 years ago, when ancient Chinese people worshiped the moon goddess, but it became a national holiday in Tang Dynasty. And there are several versions of the legends, the stories about this holiday, but no matter in which version of the legends about this holiday, the moon goddess is Chang'e, whose husband's name is Hou Yi, and Hou Yi is the one that shot down 9 suns to save the people on the earth. And since there are so many different version story, but the main narrative of this story is Hou Yi was rewarded with a pill of immortality. So from the Yellow Emperor and the Queen Mother of the Western Heavens, so he can live forever after he takes this pill. But Chang'e, the wife, felt very jealous, and she stole this pill because she thought, oh, my husband could live forever, but I cannot. So she stole the pill and flew all the way to the moon to escape Hou Yi's chase. But however, she was trapped on the moon forever by herself only, plus a jade rabbit. And she really regretted about stealing the pill, because living forever became very meaningless for her if she is separate from her loved one. So that's the main narrative of the story behind this holiday.
Nice, thank you. How is it celebrated in China? What do people do? What do they eat? And thinking about the moon, why is the moon so significant?
I always feel this holiday for Chinese is like Thanksgiving for Americans. The round moon represents reunion. So people would bring mooncakes to their family members and friends as holiday gifts, and the family would get together for a big dinner. And the people in different regions in China, they have varying preferences on the feelings of the mooncakes, what's put into the mooncakes. For example, like Shanghai style mooncakes, they like savory meat inside. And Cantonese style mooncakes would have egg yolk inside. And other popular fillings are red beans, lotus seeds, and tree nuts. So that's very common. And there are other celebration practices that I don't think we do it anymore, at least in the cities. Traditionally, the candles are lit and the incense is burned while people bow to the moon, wishing for prosperity and good fortune. And some fruits, for example, like apples, persons, grapes, and melons, all round shapes like the moon, are arranged on platters for the worship. So that's some traditional practices, but personally, I have never done that. And the moon is so significant because it is a symbol of joy and sorrow, parting and a reunion of human lives in Chinese culture. And there are so many ancient Chinese poems that use this symbol express that feelings. And I would like to quote the English translation of some lines of a very well-known poem with the symbol of moon. So here's the translation. Why then, when people part, is the moon full and bright? Men have sorrow and joy. They part or meet again. The moon is bright or dim, and she may wax or wane. There has been nothing perfect since the old days. So let us wish that man will live long as he can. Though miles apart, we will share the beauty she displays. This is a very famous poem that we always use for this holiday too. So I think the changes of the moon remind people of their families, loved ones, and hometowns. And also, unlike the sunlight that is intensely bright, the moonlight is calm and gentle like jade. And I think it's coordinated with the indirectness of the aesthetic of Chinese culture and language. So the sorrow and the joy in poems of the moon is not overwhelming. So that's, I think, why the moon is so significant.
Mm-hmm. That's so nice. Do you make homemade moon cakes or do you prefer to buy yours?
That's funny. So before I came to America, I never cooked. And then I learned cooking and became really good at it. And the mooncake is so complicated. We did that with a friend last year. And then this year she moved to Canada. So I decided to buy some mooncakes.
Nice, nice. One year I bought the molds that you put the mooncakes in. Yeah, they're very tricky.
Uh-huh.
I was very unsuccessful.
It is hard. So I would just buy professional ones.
That's perfect. Will you go anywhere in Chicago today or tomorrow to any festivals to celebrate?
We'll see if they have anything maybe in Chinatown. But usually we will first celebrate at home. I think our plan is we'll have hot pot tomorrow and then have some mooncakes tonight and tomorrow, because I have to say the mooncake, since it's like a pastry, so it has a lot of sugar and high calories. So we will be very careful, maybe share one per time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. If you are in the Nebraska area, just to give another plug, that tomorrow is the Harvest Moon Festival in Lincoln at Antelope Park at 4 p.m. In addition to spreading knowledge about the Harvest Moon Festival, I wanted to talk a little bit about Chinese culture. It's a good opportunity to move into that and really enhance our understanding. And if anyone has questions, they can put them in the chat and we can take questions. So in thinking about life in the US, so life in China, Jesse, you're in such a great position to be able to talk about that, about Chicago, where you live now, which is a really big city, compared to Wuhan, which is also a really big city. So I was wondering what similarities and differences you find between life in Wuhan compared to Chicago.
It's very interesting. It's so funny that when I moved to Chicago and I told my friends, but all my friends in Wuhan, they joked that they say, you traveled so far and for so many years, and you went back to the beginning because Wuhan was called Chicago in the East. So they say, you traveled around, so back to the beginning. And I think the reason I like Chicago so much is mainly because these two cities share so many similarities. So Wuhan has a big lake called the East Lake. So I show you some pictures. It's really big. It's bigger than the West Lake. It's off, but it's smaller than Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is more like an ocean, but it's the same pleasant experience of walking, jogging, or riding a bike along the lake. It's very similar experience, and I think like how Lake Michigan partially defined Chicago, the East Lake, the Yangtze River, the Han River, and hundreds of small lakes define the characteristics of Wuhan, the city too. And speaking of difference, I thought about it. I think I would say Chicago has a variety of ethnic communities, such as Chinatown, Ukraine Village, the Polish community, the Hispanic community, there are a lot, etc. But Wuhan mainly consists of local people. But one district that has over 10 first-tier universities attracts young migrants from different parts of China. So I think that's the biggest difference between these two cities.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny that you call it Chicago the East, because the reason why I went to Wuhan is because my undergrad had a relationship with Hwasher, the university there, and so I studied abroad in Wuhan in college, and that's how they pitched the study abroad, is because my undergrad was close to Chicago. It was 2 hours, 2.5 hours outside, and so that's how they calm down parents. Don't think of your child going super far away. They're really just going to Chicago.
Yeah, but Wuhan never gets cold, snowy winters.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a big difference between the two. There's been a couple of questions in the chat, and these are great. So if other folks have more questions, question about education. Can you talk a little bit about what education is like in China? I think that's a piece that's often very surprising to folks in comparing it to the US.
Yeah, that's a great question. I studied education for my PhD, so it's really interesting to think about the differences. It's funny that I noticed one of the many differences immediately after I came to America. So when I noticed that when American parents send their kids to school in the morning, they usually say, have fun, right? Is that what you said?
I do tell Daphne to have fun, yes. I say, have a great day, have fun.
And then usually when they pick up their kids, they usually ask, did you have fun at school today, right? But I noticed that immediately, because in the same scenario, most Chinese parents would say, behave well, work hard when they send their kids off to school. And what did you learn today would be the question naturally by the end of a school day. And I noticed it's so funny because even now, my daughter was born and grew up here, and she goes to school here. And every time when she chats with my parents, they still ask her, what did you learn at school today? I was like, that's a very hard question to answer. So that's, I think, one of the many differences I noticed immediately. And by saying that, I'm not going to enhance the stereotypes of American and Asian parents. And in addition, I think the parenting and family styles are changing both in America and in China too. And one of the biggest difference is the emphasis on hardworking and the value on education that Chinese parents hold for their children. They highly value the education. The higher education they get, they think the more success they can their children can have in the future to have a better life. And also the hardworking, they emphasize them too. And there are parents, I think the similarities, there are parents both in China and in America that put a lot of pressure on their kids to succeed in academic and sports too. And the change in China, I noticed in recent years, is that being excellent in academics is not good enough. So you also have to be you also have to be exceptional in sports and arts, because the environment is so comparative. So there are several sports that it was not popular at all, but became very popular among wealthy Chinese families. For example, horse riding, golf, sailing, skiing, and even American football. So that's very new changes. Even a lot of my friends in China, they have kids much older, in elementary school, like higher grade, fifth, sixth grade. They all start to have some skiing classes. So I was like, where do you go to? Because in Wuhan, we don't do that. So they have to do the indoor ones. So that's the new trend, I think.
And what about golf? Because one of the issues in China is land.
Yes.
So where are they golfing?
It has to be, you have to go out of the city, you have to drive hours. So imagine that, Wuhan is so big. I remember I grew up in Hankou, and the university is in Wuchang, the other district. So it takes about at least an hour without any traffic jam to arrive the other district. And then to go to golf course places like that, then you probably have to drive 2 hours.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit, before leaving education behind, can you talk a little bit about what the daily life of an elementary school student is, for example, how long kids go to school, what kind of things they learn?
Sure. It's changing too, because I usually say, I'm so glad that I was born much earlier, because now they have a lot more stress. When I was an elementary student, that was over 30 years, that was 30 years ago. So we start usually from 8 a.m. and then we finish kind of early, like 2 or 3, but we have some other after school activities. We didn't have English classes when I was an elementary school student, but now all these kids in China, they usually start English when they were in pre-K, kindergarten age, and they definitely have English classes in school, in elementary. They probably start about the same time, 8, and finish about the same time. But I heard from friends that the homework load is a lot more, and a lot of students need to do homework until 10, which I think it's crazy for first or second grade kids.
And one of my friends, she's probably mid-20s. She said that when she was going to school, sometimes she would then go back to school. She would go home, eat dinner, and then return for more classes.
That's more for middle school and high school. We have the 晚自习, which is some study time and after dinner, but you do go to school. So we do have that. I think they still keep that tradition, but the new thing, I think now the new policy that central government try to say, we want to not to have students have so much workload. But the problem is, so they will say, oh, school cannot have evening classes, or they cannot have any tutoring classes after school. But the problem is the exam, the college entrance exam has never been changed. So as long as there is a assessment there, as the only or one of the few factors that decide if you can go to a good college, then of course, then that put pressure on parents. So it's not less, it's just more.
Yeah, absolutely. And regarding sports, the question is there a most popular sport, do you think, or a few that you said some are becoming more popular, like skiing, but
Traditionally, I think like all the Asian people are crazy about soccer. But we never do the soccer game or soccer team like in America, because I feel in America the soccer thing is very popular among little kids, not older ones. But it's not. It's more like also not many girls participate in that either. So soccer definitely is popular among elementary school age, middle school age, but it's never so professional. It's just a hobby. And volleyball is popular, ping pong, of course. Basketball is popular too.
Yeah. I remember when we lived in Wuhan, basketball was really becoming really popular with Yao Ming. And
yes, I think because of that, yeah. And badminton is a very popular sports in Asia, I think. Not baseball. Baseball started to be popular. I just saw a new Chinese drama, the show that they filmed people in Shanghai, but they play baseball. I was like, that's very rare.
Very chic of them to play baseball, because baseball is really popular in Taiwan.
Yes, in Taiwan and South Korea and Japan, very popular.
Great. We are going to continue to talk about Chinese culture and history and language, but if folks have questions that they want to put in the chat or speak up, feel free to do so. One thing that I've noticed, I started going to China in 2005, and after the Olympics, 2005 to 2008 was a very different China than today. The last time I was in was 2019, right before COVID. And there's a lot of change that's happened in China recently, a lot of economic growth and expansion. And for me, I'm spending most of my time at Taoist and Buddhist temples. And they're always concerned about how do you preserve tradition among modernizing. And I know that's a concern as well for cultural festivals and traditional practices. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, of how do people maintain tradition, like celebrating the Harvest Moon Festival, but also becoming modern? How do you modernize without losing tradition?
I think enjoying the mooncakes with family is kept as a traditional practice from generation to generation. What changed is the mooncakes fillings, as I said. Traditionally, it's red bean, tree nuts, lotus seeds. But now you can have ice cream mooncakes. You can have spicy mooncakes. You can have even durian mooncakes. So it's very different, but the tradition is you can have mooncakes no matter what flavors you want. And while the economic drive keeps some traditional practice, for example, like mooncakes, this is a big market. And I just saw the news this morning that the Chinese government is trying to break down the high price of the mooncakes, because it's becoming more and more expensive in America too. But I think there were a few political movements that the central government conducted in order to prevent the young generation to be westernized. So in the past several years, I know the textbook of language arts, the Chinese language arts, and the national exams heavily put an emphasis on classical Chinese. So they have a long list of over 100 ancient time classic Chinese poems or articles that students need to learn and memorize. That's a big change. And also, it has been discussed for years that the weight of English in the national college entrance exams would be less and less, while the subject of Chinese language and culture would be more and more represented. It has been discussed for years, hasn't been changed, but it could be the future.
Interesting. So they're learning the traditional characters once again?
Not really. They're still learning the simplified characters, but still the more and more classical Chinese in the textbook.
So this is a good opportunity to talk about language, because this is something that folks who don't speak Chinese are sometimes wondering about. So Jessie speaks Mandarin, and in places like Hong Kong, it's Cantonese. Taiwan is Taiwanese, but yet the the traditional characters are the same.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about when we're saying words like traditional characters and simplified characters, what we mean?
So the characters, traditional characters that I use are still in Hong Kong and Taiwan and also Macau. It's the same as the characters we use before 1950s in mainland China too, when people all use that. But to improve the literacy rate in 1950s in China, the central government started to change a lot of characters to simplify it, make it much simplified. For example, if you can Google, it's so interesting. There is a character, I give you an example. Just Google it, the character for turtle. If you compare the simplified and the traditional, it's a big difference. And I remember that forever because years ago I worked and I taught Chinese at the University of Kansas. The second grade, one time we put that as an extra credit. So if students say, because we always introduce the simple traditional first, because it's much harder, but it keeps a lot of, yes. The first one is traditional, the second one is simplified. So the traditional characters kept a lot of original meaning of the character. But sometimes the meaning got lost if you simplify the character, but it's easier for people to write and to read. That's the main reason to improve the literacy rate. So we use that character, they learn that in the textbook, and we start to use the traditional character book at the beginning and let students to choose they want to just do the simplified or just do the traditional from the second grade. So anyway, we use that, we say, if you can write the traditional character of gui, turtle, correctly, then you get the extra points. So that's the biggest difference. And I also learned that simplified characters when I was a kid, not because I want to learn it, it's because I studied calligraphy. And if you do calligraphy, the traditional Chinese painting, you need to write the classical, the traditional way. And also I studied Chinese literature and linguistics. So we have about 2 years of classes about classical Chinese, and all the books were in traditional Chinese. So basically you have to learn that. It's not really that hard once you get used to it. And also another interesting, I thought that I don't feel it's so foreign, hard to me, was because the time I grew up, it was 80s and 90s. And that's the time that we grew up with a lot of TV shows made in Hong Kong and Taiwan. It was so popular. So we watched a lot of TV shows made in Hong Kong, Taiwan. The subtitles are traditional. So we got used to it.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. My first Chinese teacher in undergrad was from Taiwan. So we first learned traditional characters, and then simplified characters were really easy compared to traditional characters. But she was also our art teacher. And so we were doing calligraphy and art, and she would talk about the relationships of the strokes within the traditional characters. Can you say a little bit more about that when you were talking about how the traditional characters have meaning?
It's different. There are different ways when people created characters. There are different ways when we create characters. Sometimes some character, they have different parts, and usually one part tells you the meaning of this character or indicate what it's about. For example, it's about kind of animal. It's about flesh. It's about water, for example. And the other parts of the character tells you sometimes the pronunciation of the character. So unlike English, you know phonics, you can pronounce some word easily, but you may not know the meaning of the word. But for Chinese, if you know some small parts of it and you know what it means, we call it radical. The radical gives you the meaning of the character. You know, oh, even though I don't know this character, I know it's about water. So the characters of river, lake, ocean, those characters, they share the same part on the left, the radical. So we know they're all about the same concept. And the right part gives you a similar pronunciation idea. Say this character, I may be able to pronounce it, maybe right, maybe wrong, but I get an idea, a general idea about this character. So that's the biggest difference, I think, between these two languages.
And then if you're in Japan, the traditional characters are the kanji part of Japanese. So if you're in Japan, there are certain characters you'll be able to read
Yeah. I noticed that's so interesting because I visited Japan in 2015, and then in the subway, it's much slower for me to read the letters, but it's much faster to read the kanji because it's very similar as the traditional ones.
Yeah, that's great. I have one more question about language because I think it's important, but and there's a question about the pandemic in the chat that I'll ask, but if other folks have more questions, please add them to the chat. Something that I think is important about language across China is while there's a standard Mandarin and a standardized pronunciation, every region has its own dialect. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because, Wuhan people, especially when I lived there, very few people spoke English at the time. And Wuhan Chinese it sounded very different than when I was in Beijing and Shanghai. So can you talk a little bit about the differences of language?
Sure, that's a great question because that's something I always try to, because my daughter was born here, and I want her to learn some Chinese, easy to communicate with people, but I also teach her the Wuhan dialects. Because I also feel the dialects is part of the person's identity. It's so different from Mandarin, and not just each region, each city, even the small town next to Wuhan, they have a different dialects that we might understand maybe 90% part of that, but still. So, but very sadly and unfortunately, I think that in the past 20, 15, 10 years, that the trend is Mandarin became so mainstream that not just at school, because in Wuhan, I went to school and we speak Mandarin in class only when we answer questions, when we ask a question in class. But during the break, when we are at school, talk to friends, we speak local dialects. And that now the trend is a lot of kids I know, they were born in Wuhan or in maybe another different city, they are not able to speak that local dialects. I think the dialects was lost, the culture was lost in this process. One thing, because a lot of parents say, oh, I want my kids to speak Mandarin perfectly, and they worry about that the dialects affect their Mandarin pronunciation, which is a misunderstanding too. Yes, partially, like Cantonese actually. They cannot pronounce sound very well because they don't have that sound in Cantonese. Or in Wuhan dialects, we don't distinguish 支持师 or 滋滋滋, not at all, or ne and le, not at all. But it should not affect you to speak Mandarin correctly. But parents have that worry, and also with the migrant, they go to different cities, they work. So Mandarin became so mainstream that even kids cannot speak their local dialects. I feel it's very sad. So I try to teach my kids to say some very local dialects. So she learned some, which is so different.
That's great. I think a lot of times people hear about dialects and they assume it's similar to
British accent. Yes. Or I noticed first year I came to Kansas and I noticed I taught a school, actually it's a long distance teaching. So I taught a school in Arkansas and I noticed that Southern accent.
Yeah.
So I noticed that, but I told everyone, I said, cannot be compared to dialects. So let me give you an example, Wuhanhua. So I told my daughter, say, sometimes we use different words. Let's just say the same. Oh, let's just use, so in Mandarin, when you say 6, it's liu. And when you say the floor, the story is low. When you say green, the color is lu. It's all different, right? 6 is liu, and floor is low, and then green is lu. But meat is rou. They're all different meanings, different pronunciations. But in Wuhanhua, it's all the same. So the 6th floor, liu lou, we say low. And then the meat, we say low. And then the green, we say low. It's all the same. So that's really very confusing for people from a different region. They had no idea what you are talking about.
So when people are talking about that, it's really the context. Is that how you know what they're talking about? Based on the context that they're referring to?
Yes, but also we know that it all sounds the same, so we can figure it out.
So we had a question in the chat about how friends and family adapted to the pandemic. Can you say a little bit about that? And it's been recently changing in China compared to the US.
Yes. Because it started in Wuhan, so my family, all of them got quarantined over 2 months at home. And unlike here, we had a stay-at-home order, but you can still go out. You have a backyard, most people. You can go to a grocery store, but during that quarantine, you cannot go out of your apartment. So that's crazy. Imagine a lot of 2 or 3 generations, they live in the same apartment, just 2 rooms, 3 rooms. They cannot go out for 2 months. And it's very hard for them because they cannot go to get food. So it's all online ordering. It was a really hard time. And I think psychologically, it has a long-term influence on people. Now they always feel, oh, I don't want to go somewhere far away or travel too much because they have the code on their phone. So they worry that if they travel to somewhere and the phone, the code will change into a red one or yellow one, then they will be quarantined at some place they don't want to be. So I think that really psychologically changed them. And I even know some of my friends' parents, they're afraid to go out when the quarantine ended in April 2020. So I think the psychological stress for them is a lot and it's long-term. And then what I noticed the most is the long-term effect on kids. For example, one of my cousins, she lived in Tianjin, which is really close to Beijing. And her son was in 2nd grade, now starting 3rd grade. But unfortunately, I look at their calendar. She showed me that the entire 2nd grade, her son, he only went to school in person for less than 60 days. And if it's imagine that's really hard for a 2nd grade kids to go through this, and no friend, online classes, cannot go out to play. So it's very hard for parents, for kids. And now they start another new round of stay at home, the quarantine. So he started the 3rd grade with online classes again.
Wow. Another question that came in the chat is about Chinese students being highly disciplined. Is that discipline instilled at a young age? You talked a lot about the pressure that's put on, but kind of that discipline for study. Is that something that you learned at a young age, or and that is still being taught to young children?
I think it's a culture thing that, at least for my generation, that we learned that you have to work hard. I still say that to my daughter, but sometimes I have to say it's not 100% true. We always say practice makes perfect. It's not 100% true, but you need to practice and work harder so you can be better. There are a lot, you can notice that too, that there are a lot more and more younger generation of Chinese students studying America. And when I studied America before, the majority of the students were graduate students, right? But 10 years ago, start to be undergraduate, start to be a lot of actually middle school, high school, that the parents just send them here. I know some of them are disciplined, some of them are not. It depends on, the reason they came here. If they just think, the family think, oh, it might be easier for the kids to go to a college because they didn't do very well in China, then very likely they don't do very well here either. I think it's the same. It depends on the family.
One of my best friends, when we were at Huasher, she said that in order to work and be a mom, her parents watched her son almost 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Is that something that you see among your friends as well?
It's very common. It's extremely, extremely common. And in China, there's no like daycare, especially for kids under 3. So it's very hard for parents to take care of the kids and go to work. So most of the time, I have to say 99% of the time, grandparents step in, watch the kids until they turn 3 and go to the pre-K kindergarten.
Wow. Wow. As we're winding down today, if there's other thoughts or other questions that come up, please add them to the chat. We're so fortunate to be able to spend this time with you, Jessie, because it's the harvest moon and you're able to talk about Chinese culture and language. In your time in Chicago, have you visited, you were talking about Chinatown, have you visited that area of Chicago? And if so, I remember when you visited us in San Francisco, I think you and Michael went to the Chinatown in San Francisco. So if you have, what observations did you have visiting?
Sure. Actually, Chinatown is just 1.5 mile away from the apartment. It's very close, but it's very similar. It's a much smaller one compared to the one in San Francisco. But all the Chinatowns I went to, I always joke about it. I feel often kind of stuck in the last century, maybe 1950s, 60s, forever. I think partially it was because the immigrants that established it, they were from that time mainly or even earlier. So they had a very closed community. And they kept that tradition. But the new Chinese who come here, they are more, most of them study computer science, business, medicine, pharmacy, those kind of fields. So they won't leave in Chinatown. So they won't change Chinatown. And then Chinatown people who live there forever, there is no change. And then it became kind of like, a tourist place for a lot of people. So I think that's why. But we love the food over there.
And sometimes tourism helps to preserve those things of the past, because there's money that's put into preserving old buildings. I know that's happened quite a bit in mainland China, of kind of restoring old buildings because of tourism, especially places like the Yellow Crane Tower in Wuhan.
Yeah.
Have you been back to China since 2019? Have your parents been able to come here?
No. So the last time my parents were here, it was 2019 summer. And then originally they planned to visit us again 2020 in January. And then the city shut down 3 days before their flight tickets. So they were not able to come. And another thing I would like to say is not just because the difficulties of traveling, the flight got canceled a lot. A lot of Chinese parents here, when they visit their family here, it's very hard and expensive for them to fly back right now because so many flights got canceled. But also the quarantine, because now they shortened that to 7 days plus 3 days at home. For the past almost 2 years, the quarantine time to China was 14 days, plus 14 days. So a month. And then, my parents had a family friend whose daughter lives in Japan and she goes there a lot. So she came back from Japan in the middle of the pandemic, and then she had a quarantine for a month. And she said she almost felt she was so depressed. And then I believe that. So my parents said they don't want to travel as long as there is a quarantine. And I understand that. The same for us too. It's very hard to travel to China with a 4 or 5-year-old kid in a hotel room for weeks.
Oh gosh. when I took Daphne when she was 10 months to China, that was challenging. So I can't imagine having her at 4.5 in a hotel room. She would. And then the funny thing is, we have a friend moved back to China because of her husband's job to Beijing. I think 2021 April. So they all moved back, but they pack all their stuff and shipping to China, and they waited over a year to receive the shipments. Oh, wow. Because the Chinese government wants to let all those shipments from America be cleaned for a certain time. Oh, wow. Wow. Well, we are coming to the 1 o'clock hour. If there's any final questions, please ask those. Jesse, is there anything that I didn't ask you about the Harvest Moon Festival or about Chinese culture that you really think is important for folks to know?
Actually, I did some research for the Moon Festival when I look at the questions. Because for Chinese people, I feel 'cause it became the tradition, so you don't get to think about it. But the story I thought is so funny because I read that story to my daughter, and she stole the PO because she wanted to live forever. She got so jealous, but I thought it's so funny. But I think the meaning behind it was still very philosophical in Chinese culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember talking to some of my students a few years ago about the moon, and they said, while we might be in Nebraska, when we look at the moon, it's the same moon as our family in China. And I found that so touching. I'm thinking about the moon and looking at the same moon, and it's such a unique festival. It seems for that special connection.
Yes, especially for people travel far away from their family and hometown, because we have an ancient poem saying 月是故乡明, the moon is the brightest in your hometown when you see it. So that reminds a lot of people travel far away to miss their family and hometown.
Oh, that's so nice. Well, thank you, Dr. Jessie Jiang, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you are in Lincoln, tomorrow the Harvest Moon Festival is at 4 p.m. And Nicole put information in the chat. And look at the moon tonight. And Nicole, do you have some final thoughts?
I don't. I just wanted to thank Jesse for your time. That was excellent.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy mooncakes.
Thanks, Jessie.